So who are you and what do you do?
I am Stephen Shapiro, and I am all things innovation. I've spent my entire career, 30 years, focused on helping companies grow through innovation.
Got a new book out?
I do. It is called Pivotal.
Oh, it's like a
It is,
commercial here.
yeah. Yeah. So basically, the premise of the book is we've spent so much time spinning around in circles, pivoting, changing direction, changing strategies. And the premise of this book is that we need to start focusing on what doesn't change, what's timeless. And, instead of focusing on what's next and new, let's focus on what's now and how do we double down on what matters most. So it's a sort of a refreshing take on strategy that allows us to get some sanity back into the workplace.
So I'm a deep fan of this type of thinking. I'm the first person to say that I'm not a futurist. I like talking about what's now, not what's next. Where did this come from in terms of what was happening in the world? I get this feeling that we've been prognosticating a lot, trying to constantly tell people what's next, without really spending time in what's worked, what's been really, really effective. What happened for you in terms of that moment versus turning that into a book versus thinking about that in terms of business and strategy?
Well, first of all, I love the perspective of what works because I think we're so fast to throw the baby out with the bathwater type of thing. And the reason why this book came about was it came about during the pandemic when I just started having virtual calls with my clients, and there was just, you could see fear in their eyes, whether they were leaders not knowing what to do or they were frontline workers who were confused because they were getting conflicting information. And when you start looking at the numbers in terms of stress and burnout and confusion, it's just not a fun time to be in most organizations. And so I try to look at what's going on. Why are people so stressed out right now? And the reason is because there was a lack of consistent and clear communication about what matters most. It seemed like there was a flavor of the month type of thing. Well, we're working on this today, but hey, we have inflation. We need to go in a different direction. We got supply chain issues. We have to deal with that. Oh, labor shortages. We have to deal with that. And now we've got AI. Okay, what the heck are we going to do with that? And everybody was jumping on to the next thing rather than trying to figure out, what do we do today that's better than anyone else that we can leverage that will give us some stability? Maybe we can't predict, but we can at least create some level of stability.
It's such a crazy thing to think about. And this is where I might be spending most of my time when I'm not doing things like this, because I think about that moment and I think about how much work has changed and how much even we see that work has changed. Even here we sit heading towards the end of 2024. And people still are talking about return to office. People are fighting it. People are resistant to the ways of the world. People aren't necessarily dealing with the macro issues like inflation at scale. And I would think that in this moment, we would have some of the biggest breakthroughs in terms of new ways to work and seeing actual culture shift and seeing these things come along as permanence. I relate it to business books and how it's amazing how in the past 2 years we haven't seen some of the biggest business book ideas break through and come through after we've really had this chance to reevaluate everything we know about work. And I was reading Pivotal and thinking, I don't think the pandemic factors into the reason why we should act like this. Can you square that circle for me? Because it seems bizarre that we are still speaking in very traditional ways about business when it feels like everyone's saying business has changed forever.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating is, and you're right, I think during the pandemic, you would have thought it would give us a chance to do some form of reset. But I think the reality is we just applied new technologies to old practices. And that's not really innovation. So you look at how you ran meetings. Okay, well, we can't do them in person. Let's do them on Zoom. And so I don't think there was actually a lot of reflection. I think there was a lot of reaction. And unfortunately, when you're reacting like that, you're not going to be developing anything that's new or powerful. And again, the premise of the book isn't trying to figure out what's the next bright, shiny object, what's the next new thing. We need to figure out what really is serving us. But equally important is to figure out what's not serving us. Because if we can get laser focused, so one of the key premises of the book is to innovate where you differentiate. So if you can figure out what you do better than anyone else in the world and you can focus your energies there, everything else becomes noise and you need to figure out a way of minimizing it. And I think
So
during the pandemic, everything became an opportunity when in fact 90% of the opportunities were just distractions
yeah.
masquerading as opportunities. And that's for me really the key premise of the book is discerning opportunities from distractions, figuring out what we need to focus on versus what we think might be cool and different.
But putting the book aside though, just help me think through this. If we didn't have the time to reflect and change then, where- like, I just look at it in that perspective as a business thinker. This is the one that I grapple the most with. If we didn't reflect and change when the world was shut down and everybody was shut down, what makes us think we're going to do it in this moment or the next moment? I would have thought that moment is where we would have seen the best change, the most motions forward.
Well, I think there's that expression, necessity is the mother of invention. But I actually think that I've always said laziness is the father of innovation. And what I mean by that is we need to, like, if we're doing things out of necessity, the pandemic wasn't a time of reflection. It was a time of reaction. And during times of reaction, we might develop things, but they tend to be more incremental and built on the past. And I think if we can, and again, the premise is that if we can figure out what's truly an opportunity and recognize what's a distraction, what's not our differentiator, we then can at least take some time to breathe and rethink. So I think we're actually coming out of a period of time when we just didn't have the time to think. I think now is the time we could potentially do it if we really started to use the right practices. Unfortunately, I think things like AI are making it much more difficult because everybody's like, we got to do AI, we got to do AI. And it's like, take a breath.
Yeah.
You're not going to AI everything in your company. What you need to figure out is how do you leverage AI the right way and leverage the right partners the right way in order to have an AI solution that works. But everything seems to be like an opportunity or a challenge or an issue or a problem. And if we keep chasing those, we're never going to have time to breathe. So my hope is the book gives people a chance to just stop for a
Yeah.
moment and just think what really matters most in putting your energies there.
I like the fact that you're bullish on now being the time to think. AI is one of them, but it feels like this, even the idea of short termism, which I spoke a lot about and still do to this day, still feels gone. Still feels like we're chasing markets and quarterly earnings, and now more than ever being disrupted by external factors more than internal ones. Help people take that deep breath and that pause. How do you mitigate against it? How do you get people thinking about that or actually taking the breath? Does anybody feel like they have the time to do this? How do we make the time? What are your thoughts on really getting the organization around the campfire on this idea?
So one of the key things that I explore, there's a framework that I developed. Actually, I developed this 2 decades ago, and I've been
Yeah.
using it for a long time. And it just, no matter what people do to try to challenge the framework, it always works. And it's basically this premise that there's 3 types of work that we do. These aren't departments, functions, people, roles, but there's 3 types of work that we do. There's support, core, and differentiating. Support work is work that supports the business but doesn't create customer value. Core work are the table stakes. These are the things we have to get right, but it's not the reason someone's going to do business with you. But if you get it wrong, they will leave. And then the differentiators are the reason why people do business with you. And so when I work with my clients, and it's not just the top leaders, but this has to cascade down to every single person in the organization. When we start to say, what is your differentiator and get crystal clear on it, what's core. And here's the fascinating thing is the reason why companies are so busy is they're spending, let's ignore support for the moment, which is like payroll and meetings and things that just customers don't care about. If we just focus on core, which are the table stakes, the expectations, and then the differentiators, which is, again, the reason why someone does business with you. When I look at most companies' investments, it's between 70 to 80% in core and only 20 to 30% in differentiating. And so the way you take a breath is to say, my core work shouldn't be custom. My core work has to be great, but it doesn't have to differentiate. It just has to be excellent. And therefore, I need to find the right strategy, which is often partnerships. And when we find those partnerships, here's the great thing, just sort of segueing a little bit into AI, is if you're spending 60% of your or 80% of your time on core, well, you're going to have to put AI enablement into those core solutions. But if you partner with people for your core, they will do the work on enabling their solutions with AI. So now you're actually, again, hyper focusing your energies. And that's, to me, the key to making time is to figure out where do you put your money down and where do you stop investing, or at least where do you use different strategies that take less time.
So, what's the provocation of the book? I took it to be this idea of deepening versus being distracted.
Yeah.
When you think about this idea of deepening, one, how do you help people understand that? And two, when someone believes in this, and I don't see any reason not to, I really enjoyed reading the book, where do they start picking at it? Does it solely reside in the core?
Well, the core and the support, people spend a lot of time on that. The first thing is to get just crystal clarity on the differentiator. And most people don't even understand what a differentiator is. They hear the word differentiating and they assume that means what makes us different. And that is so far from a differentiator. I wished I'd used a different word sometimes, but it's the right word, because our differentiator, first of all, is rarely a product, service, offering, or even a business model. Our differentiator is a capability that allows us to repeatedly create new products, services, offerings, but it's a capability. And it's not just about being different, but it's also about being desirable and durable. It's something which has to stand the test of time. It has to be difficult for others to replicate, and it has to be something that the market wants. And so when we sort of triangulate on those three pieces, we get something that's pretty powerful. And that's the first step, though, is when I work with most companies, they understand missions and visions and
Right.
purpose and sort of fluffy things that don't necessarily translate into actual and tangible strategy. If we can get crystal clear on our differentiator, now we can then use that support core and differentiating model to say, here's our investment strategy here, and anything that's differentiating, that's where we go deeper. We're not changing direction, but we're creating more value for our best customers because we have a capability that can create more value and create greater goodness for them. So the whole premise of Pivotal is, instead of spinning, you become irreplaceable. And the way you become irreplaceable is the more you integrate what you do into the lives of your customers and clients in a way that you're so valuable they can't exist without you.
Give us a quick example of that output. What does the output of that look like?
When you say the output in terms of
A company, and what did ultimately change or stay the same, or what was the deepening in the end, so that we could see a before and after snapshot of how we
Sure.
get what this deepening looks like.
So there's several. One which I like because it's just a very simple example is Otis Elevator. So you think about elevators. It's a pretty
It's
complex
an up and down
business.
business. No, I'm just kidding.
It's up and down. I wish I thought of that one.
It's what we do, Steve.
So, there you go. Boom, boom. So they were originally in the elevator business manufacturing elevators. And then what they realized is, we're not experts in elevator manufacturing. We're experts, our capability, again, it's about capabilities, not their product. We're experts in all things having to do with elevators. So we are great at maintaining elevators and installing elevators and making sure that they're working. And when they shifted away from just manufacturing elevators to now servicing elevators, first of all, they could service anyone's elevators, not just Otis. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but a very large percentage of their profit, I think it's something close to 80% of their profit now, comes actually from those services rather than the manufacturing of the elevators, which was their original business. And so sometimes in order for us to go deeper, we have to broaden our definition. So I'll come back actually to the very beginning. You asked me, who am I? And okay, well, what do I do? And the quick answer a lot of people would say is, I'm a speaker, right? You and I were in the speaker world. I'm a speaker, but I'm not a speaker. Speaker is just one of the things I offer. I'm an innovation expert who, I do speeches, but I do apprenticeship programs, workshops, and training and advisory. If I called myself a speaker, I can't really go deep. But when I say I'm an expert in all things innovation, just like Otis is an expert in all things elevators, Well, now it gives me the opportunity to deepen the value I can create for my clients. Yes, I can do a speech, but I get off the stage and I can spend a year with them going through my mastery program where they learn anything and everything there is to know about my process. So I think that's one, just very simple example of going deep.
So the idea would be that if you think what you do is install elevators and service them, the deepness is in the expansion about the communication of what all of that entails, and making sure that when you do all of those things, you're doing them at the level by which you do those primary things that people might potentially just know you for. Would that be
Yes.
fair?
Yeah. I mean, so again, it's figuring out what is the competency, the capability that we have that we do better than anyone else, and how can we leverage that in as many different ways as possible. And when we start to do that, one of the things which I find really incredibly useful, especially if you're in a B2B business, so if you sell to other businesses, is if you have a conversation with a customer or a client and you get them to think about support, core, and differentiating, and you can help them laser focus and identify their differentiator. Now, what you say is anything that's core support, you shouldn't be focusing on. You should be partnering with others. By the way, what we offer takes care of your core. So now you can focus on your differentiator. You can innovate where you differentiate. So it's that conversation about leveraging a capability as deeply as possible to create as much value for your customers.
So what's not obvious here? Why do business struggle with this? It seems like the best ideas are the most obvious ideas. You and I talk about this a lot. We've been friends for many years. Why do people struggle with this? It seems so interesting to think we service this industry. What are the products or services we sell? What are the gaps? Where are the opportunities? How do we? It seems very 101 when we talk about it like this,
Yeah,
because it is.
it is. It is. That's the crazy thing. I mean, these are look to me. I don't really anything I do is really principle based because I think principles are timeless. No, so no matter what comes our way, but I think we've been given a lot of either faulty principles. I mean, look, one of my books is called Best Practices Are Stupid. And the reason for that is because most of the people spouting best practices don't even know whether or not that practice was the reason why they were successful. And even if it was what made them successful, it might not be useful to someone else for a whole variety of reasons. And so I think it's just so important for people to go back. Again, it's back to basics. It is the 101 fundamentals, but we get so caught up in you read all the different periodicals and magazines and books, and everybody's talking about what's next. 90% of the books these days seem like they're on AI. Every column on if the word AI isn't used about 150 times, there's something wrong with that call. But that just means we're getting distracted again. It's like if I'm a healthcare organization, I need to understand AI, but I'm never going to become the expert in AI. That's not going to be my differentiating capability. But we just get distracted.
But there's a bit of a fear in that. Let's use this as an example because I should push back a little bit on this, not because I do that.
Yeah, please.
I don't, but I am able to look at changes and realize that if we're not paying attention to them and understanding where a business or a business model might benefit from it, I think the scale with AI is for sure speed, which is an interesting topic, but more importantly, how it inputs the both front end and back end in terms of real impact. And how do we think about that in a world where if we are trying to be competitive and maintain the edge of the competitiveness, it would be a misstep in the digital transformations we've seen since, let's call it the late 90s, maybe, that too many businesses missed the internet.
Yeah.
They missed mobile. They missed social. They missed so many components of it that you wound up seeing many of the disruptors that became trillion-dollar companies almost walk through that. So there is something there about having to do the work one does while also not absolving themselves of that responsibility that they have as some type of leader. There's something there that, it must be complementary. It can't be an either or.
Oh, no, it's definitely not an either or. I think it's really a matter of focus and priority. And I think it's what's in the foreground versus what's in the background. And I think for a lot of companies right now, AI seems to be in the foreground. And I'm not saying, look, table stakes, the whole point of core is that these are the expectations. AI is core. If you don't have AI enablement in your solutions, you will not be differentiated. So, and here's the problem is it's changing so fast. So if you, I'll just use a healthcare company again. Let's say you're a healthcare organization and you invest a ton of money in knowing AI and becoming great at AI and creating AI enabled solutions. As soon as you've implemented it, the technology is changing so fast that it's going to be obsolete. I've seen this so many companies that have an AI enabled solution and then somebody else the next day comes out with something that's better because the tools are improving. So you need to understand it. It is table stakes, but I do think that trying to become an expert in all things AI is going to move you in the wrong direction. That's why you need to find the right partners. The people who spend their entire lives thinking about AI should be a part of your team. Now, some of those people could be employees. There's nothing wrong with that,
Yeah.
but they need to make sure they don't get sucked into the other parts of the business because they need to stay on the bleeding edge of things.
But the fear is real that if those people or partners exist, they could eat us for lunch. The fear does exist that if we don't do this and the competitors do, sometimes that fear is real. I mean, I think you're right that we talked about things like the multiverse and that hasn't come to fruition. But there are others that do come along every once in a while that make me stand back and think there's many people that might be abdicating that responsibility to a partner and that could be the death of them ultimately. I mean, it's early days on AI, so we probably can't state that this is the one, but there's something unique about one's ability as an organization to navigate those and figure out which are the big ones, which are the ones that maybe we can pass off to a partner. I mean, that's the challenge for a lot of these organizations is figuring that out, I'm assuming.
Well, I think that's exactly right, is figuring it out. That prioritization is really the key thing. So if you figure out what you differentiate in, that's where you want to put your energy with AI enablement. That's really the main thing. Anything that's support or court, hopefully somebody else's solution that you are working with will have AI.
Yeah.
So it's just prioritizing where you put it. You can't abdicate responsibility. You can't give it to someone else just to say, okay, here, you go do it. I'm certainly not suggesting that. But right now, it seems like everybody's strategy is AI. Their strategy can't be AI. Their strategy has to be whatever their differentiator is, supported by AI, and they need to do the right things.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I use AI all the time, um, and it's incredibly powerful. But I will never claim to be an AI expert. So I need to use it smartly, and then I find people that I can learn from and partner with for some of the tools that I'm just not going to be able to do it properly.
Yeah. Trends is another interesting aspect to this because one of the ways in which Pivotal works is navigating trends and again, the assessment and how it works. But what I do find interesting about trends is there are some companies that are just massively successful because that's what they do. They do it so well. Then there are others that we tend to think of not being very modern. They're more traditional in the industry. How do you think trends impact how we think about things like how we pivot, how we deepen what we're doing? How do we not be distracted? Riding trends can be as dangerous as it could be the way in which you build a business model. It's very personal, I'm going to guess.
It's very personal, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And so what I'm trying to do, so the subtitle of the book is Creating Stability in an Uncertain World. And the analogy I use is a pivot in basketball. And if you think about a pivot in basketball, basically there's a foot moving around in circles. That's, when we talk about pivoting in business, that's what we're focused on. But there's that foot that's planted to the ground, the foot that doesn't move. You still need to shift direction, but it should be built on a solid foundation rather than quicksand. And that's really the main message is I'm not saying don't pivot, but get that solid foundation of at least understanding what matters most and then shift direction when necessary. So start being pivotal, then you can pivot. And I think most companies have it, they're in such a reactionary mode right now that so trends come along and they're like, I don't know what to do, but there's less certainty. So if you're not as certain, you want to be placing smaller bets. And there's a whole section on how do you place smaller bets. Basically more certain, which is basically on your differentiator, bigger, deeper, double down bets. less certainty about the future and trends, well, you need to sort of test it out a little bit and do a better job of experimentation.
I love watching
And
the final version of this come together because we've been talking about this topic a long time. You've been bouncing back and forth with not just analogies like the pivot in basketball, but titles and how to structure this. And one of the things I think we talked about, which is an interesting topic, is in hearing you say this, it's almost like you're the anti innovation expert. And I say that cautiously because that's not really what you're doing at all or what you're saying at all. But our definition of innovation is so engendered in all of the things you're telling people to think more deeply about. You're fighting a bit of a tidal wave in this. Do you feel that we maybe need to redefine what innovation? It seems like we need to redefine innovation. It's the only way to do this. Otherwise, we're going to constantly be trapped in trends, things that move fast, things that change. And innovation also isn't attached to any result, which is the other interesting thing that I pulled out of reading Pivotal. There is no intrinsic result of innovation that we could describe. There is the performance of the organization at the end, of course, but I don't know if that's just like the best practice, if it's related to the fact that they innovated or not.
yeah, well, I'll tell you a quick story from the first story in Best Practices Are Stupid, I think gets at what you're talking about, because our traditional definition of innovation is about change. So I tell the story about these two hikers in the mountains of Canada, because actually I went hiking in Canada and we saw a bear. And so, and everybody knows the story. It's like they stumble across this bear. And so they're like, one person one of the guys sits down on the rocks, takes off his hiking boots, puts on his running shoes. And the other guy looks at him and says, "What are you doing? You can't outrun a bear." And the other guy says, "Yeah, I know. I just need to outrun you."
Right. It's got to be faster than you. It's the best joke ever.
That's the old joke. But here's the reality. This is the reality, is the person who was not putting on his running shoes said, "Go ahead." And the reason is he knows that bears have bad eyesight and they're going to go after whatever's moving. And so the bear's actually going to go after the person who is running. So this whole thing about trying to stay one step ahead of the competition sometimes is a misnomer. It's a red herring in some respects, because it's not about change for change's sake. It's not about, we focus on trying to go fast, but are we going fast in the right direction? I would rather stop, reassess our direction. If I'm trying to go north and I'm going 100 miles an hour south, I will never get to my destination no matter how fast I try to go. So we need to stop and just make sure, are we moving in the right direction? And it's not just about speed, but it's about direction and making sure that we're really solving the right problems rather than just any problem.
So is it a slippery slope? Meaning, if we follow what you're talking about in Pivotal, and I recommend that we do, deepening versus distracting, how do we avoid, as we're doing that, what I think would be an obvious detour, which is complacency? That we get to the point in the conversation where we can become complacent because we're deepening, but it's the stuff we always did, or it's the stuff we're refining and tweaking. Complacency is like water. It's going to leak in. And once it does, it's going to find its way in some way, shape, or form. So how do you defeat that in the new model? How do you keep people still energetic and not getting complacent?
So complacency and arrogance, I think, are two real big enemies. Because look, well-meaning leaders, they're confident in our solutions, but the problem is, I always say expertise is the enemy of innovation. Our past experiences limit our ability to see new and different futures. So we may have known our customers, we may have known the competition, we may have known our industry. It doesn't mean we know it. So I'm with you 100%, which is why I talked about the first 3Ds, which are distinctive, desirable, and durable, which basically means create something that's distinctive, that stands out, that people want, that's going to be difficult to replicate. But the fourth D is dynamic, which says once we have that stable foundation, once we have that planted foot, now we need to always be sensing what's happening. And here's the thing which I find really fascinating is most people assume the biggest disruptions are going to happen from technology. Technology will be a huge disruptor, but I also think we tend to ignore societal shifts. What are buyer behaviors that are going to change? What are regulations and how are they going to impact what we're doing? So we need to always have sort of this radar system, not to totally throw out what we've done, but to try to figure out when do we need to adjust? How do we adjust? But the key is we're always still building on what makes us great rather than trying to chase what's next. And again, if you're in a product business or a service business or an offering business, it's always going to change. I mean, Apple comes out with a new phone every single year. They're not in the phone business. They have a capability, which is their network and their design. That's their business. So they try to figure out, what can I create with that that's going to be desirable in the future? So we can't just be desirable today. We have to be desirable in the future. And that's going to be based on a number of different changes.
Yeah, I do like the Apple example. I tend to use that in my keynotes, just the ability for them to understand the services side of it, and how when people think about Apple or get questioning about it in terms of their industrial design and products, I'm always marveling at how they're growing and deepening the service side of it, which is locking people in, it's resisting churn, it's bringing in new customers and keeping them in, it's new things that we're seeing, whether it's partners developing apps, whatever it might be. But that's where the money is starting to really ride for them, which is very different from our perception of them not even 20 years ago.
If you have an ecosystem, and Apple, I think, was maybe really one of the first incredible ecosystems with iTunes. Yeah. It wasn't the iPod. I mean, the iPod was a great invention, but there were a million MP3 players. To me, the real innovation was iTunes. It was a network of artists and record labels where you could buy songs, and it was integrated. And now I would say that one of their big things is the way iCloud works and the integration. I mean, I have in front of me, I've got a Mac Mini, I've got a MacBook Pro over here, I've got an iPhone here, I've got an iPad over there. There's no way in the world I could use any technology other than Apple, only because they work seamlessly together. And it's like, if you have a Google Nest home, you're probably not going to bring in, Amazon products or whatever. And what companies are trying to do is deepening relationships. Insurance companies, you see all the ads, bundling. That's always the big thing, bundling. We've got car, we got automotive, we got motorcycle, we got boats, we got houses, because it locks you in. The more you can bundle, the more you can build that ecosystem of your products, the harder it is for somebody to break in.
But out of the gates, it's the story you tell in the book, that if you don't do the core well and you suddenly start adding in all this stuff, there's cautionary tales, real case studies right in the front of the book that feel very real and very scary, that you see it work and then you see it not work. When you talk about what works, you do mention this idea that it's the core that stays the same. We've seen businesses really grapple with the core. And I'm just curious how you think about that. What does someone do when they're seeing that the core is being eroded, that the core market is going away?
Well, and again, maybe we're using core in different ways. I mean, I always think about it in terms of the differentiator and having that solid, that differentiator. So like one of the opening stories in the book was HomeJoy. It was a company that was founded. They were in home cleaning. They grew just ridiculously fast because they offered an inexpensive service. But the problem was they did a terrible job of customer retention and cleaner retention. They had only like 20% of their customers return after their first service. So they grew fast, but they didn't have a solid differentiator. They didn't have anything that was stable. And then they decided, well, we've already got this great network. Let's add on plumbing, and let's add on electrical, and let's add on all these other services. And the problem is they weren't related to house cleaning. They were totally different. So not only do they have a differentiator that wasn't stable and viable and sustainable, but then they added on things which were they weren't even tangential. They sounded the same, but they weren't. And that's why it's so critical to get clear about that before we start making any changes. Now, when your differentiator starts to erode, so in the book I talk about, for example, Philip Morris, which 100% of their income was from tobacco products, from cigarettes. And they've made a public statement saying, look, clearly that's not going to be a viable differentiator in the future. And so they've invested billions in developing recreational products that aren't based on cigarettes. And right now they have like this one product called IQOS, which is a device which it does use tobacco, but it doesn't burn it, it heats it. So it gives a person who really wants to have that cigarette experience, the same experience, but it's significantly less dangerous to the body. And I think now 35% or so of their revenues are coming from those types of non-cigarette recreational products. So you have to change when the world changes. You just can't sit still.
Go down that a little bit, because the societal shifts and the macro factors at play at work today are very, I would say, very scary. They're very intimidating for people. You're talking about multiple global wars. We had some supply chain issues, which, whether they're resolved or not, I still think are going to be implicated by what's happening. You're seeing a lot of nationalism, which means foreign exchange is shifting in different ways. We talked earlier a little bit about worker sentiment. I'm not trying to create a litany of problems in the world, but I do think that if you are a leader today, the challenges you're facing in terms of growth and time to grow and the types of people you have is not just a function of the products and services you sell and how well you do it, but a lot of these externalities. Now, I've spoken to other people, and the general sentiment I get back is, yeah, life is tough. Like, pull up your pants and get rolling. But I'm never satiated by that. I wonder if you think about that as well, where what happens when less and less of it is the business and your marketing and what's happening, but these external factors that are impacting how you output and who you can work with.
And I think I know a lot of people do say, suck it up, or
Yeah, like
whatever.
that's life. You're a leader, that you have to deal with
Yeah,
the cards you're handed. Yeah.
that's not really very useful advice. I guess the way I look at it, and I'm banging the same drum over and over, but it's basically, if you get clear on what makes you distinctive, desirable, and durable, no matter what happens in the world, that still becomes your leverage point. That's the thing which you can still do. So again, come back to, Philip Morris. Were they in the cigarette business? Well, maybe, but they were in the recreational, experience business. Well, if you redefine it that way, you end up with different solutions. And that was a societal shift. So I think it's the same, whether it's government mandates, whether it's wars, whether it's inflation. We still need to figure out ways of leveraging our differentiators, but we do have to adjust them accordingly. And just, I don't know if this is going to be a relevant point, but one of the things which we seem to believe is that constraints are bad. Like, we don't like constraints. But in my previous book, Invisible Solutions, the whole point of that book is we actually like constraints. When we say to people, think outside the box, they are less likely to come up with a good solution. People want the box. The problem is they're in the wrong box. So if you redefine the box, now we can create better solutions. And so I think the same thing is true with all the external factors you talked about. They're boxes. How do we reframe that box to help us leverage what we do and come up with some creative solutions? So I think it's still a creative endeavor to be able to deal with those types of challenges.
How do you feel about the idea of slow innovation? I was thinking about this a lot, that when we talk about deepening, can we do it quickly, or is it an act of taking that break and slowing it down? The reason I say this is because earlier we mentioned this, and it's pretty obvious that innovation happens at the speed of light. Like, you never hear about innovation without the word speed being the big thing. Deepening requires a bit of a pause. It requires a bit of reflecting. It requires a steady hand, if you will. Walk me through that idea of slow versus fast. I've been grappling with this a lot, because I'll get up on stage and I'll talk about disruption and innovation, as I do as well, in a different way than you do. And I keep saying the same thing, that speed is stupid to talk about, isn't it, ultimately? Because when did we ever not say everything's coming so fast? I can remember when the first computers came in, early 80s. I had an Atari 800. And from that moment forward, and I was young, I was in my teens, all I heard after that forever was how fast everything is happening. And it just got me to the point of almost the idea of, like, who broke the 4-minute mile, and once they did, everybody was able to do it. Like, why do we still talk about speed? If everything's going fast, we're always going fast, we're going fast. Why is that anything here? But then if we say slow down, people go, oh, you're going to slow down. Do you think about that also?
All the time. And I'll give you one story, and I'll just repeat something I said before, which is, speed is different than, let's say, velocity. Velocity is speed in a direction. Going fast in the wrong direction just means you're going further away from where you need to go. So sometimes you need to just stop and say, am I moving in the right direction? But the story that I think is more interesting, which you might find fascinating, especially since you're up in Montreal, home of one of the Formula One Grand Prix.
Yeah.
Back when I lived in London, I worked for a Formula One team. And look, at the time, Formula One wasn't very popular in the US, but I moved to London in the late 90s, and one of my first projects was with this Formula One team because we were a sponsor of them. And I thought it was fascinating. I mean, I didn't really know much about it. I mean, I knew they were fast cars. I knew they were talented drivers, but the pit crews, the pit stops were just, it would blow my mind. It wasn't like other sports where they're pretty fast. Formula One is like ridiculously fast. And so I would watch them. And I remember asking one of the guys on the team, I said, how do you get a pit crew to go so fast? Now, back when I was working with them, there were 19 people around a car, changing the tires. We also fueled the car back then. They don't do that now, doing minor maintenance. And so I asked, how do you get them to go fast? And he said, we tell them to go fast. That's not very interesting. So yeah, but that's what we do. We sit there with a stopwatch and we move them around and we rotate them and they just go over and over and over. And then there's a point that no matter what they did, no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't go 1/1000th of a second faster. It was their best time. Couldn't do anything better. So they thought, how do we get them to go faster? And they tried a number of different techniques that managers might have tried, which is, we'll give you more money. Had the opposite effect. They went slower. You can, have your name in lights, get all these cool, crazy things. And then they tried something, which gets exactly to your point. They told the pit crew members, we're not going to time you. We're actually going to evaluate your style. You're going to go fast. So this is not about just, looking, beautiful as you're doing it. Go fast, but as you're changing the tires, think smooth. As you're fueling the car, think smooth. As you're working the jacks, think smooth. So they were thinking about smooth, going fast. Of course, they were timed, and they found they went 0.2 to 0.3 of a second faster than their previous times, and everybody on the pit crew thought they were going slower. And I call this the performance paradox. And there's 100 years of research that actually shows us that we can overstimulate, overmotivate people to the point where their performance actually starts to deteriorate. And so in many cases, for us to go faster, again, coming back to that new versus now, the reason why the stopwatch doesn't work as well in some cases is because that's the new, that's the future. Time doesn't happen until it's over, but my movements are in the moment. And so if we can start focusing on those types of things, what we can do is get the optimal effect. And when it comes to innovation, there's some studies that I do with my clients just to demonstrate the point that we can actually, by overstimulating, over-motivating somebody, we can destroy their ability to be creative 100%. So slowing down is actually a really important part of the innovation process.
Yeah. I'm also curious about culture. I know it's an area you spend a lot of time on. I grapple with it only because we develop multiple businesses across multiple cities with different types of people and departments. And I always grappled with, is culture something that is set top down versus a culture is people? The people example I used, and I've spoken to you about it. I think I've mentioned it on the show a couple of times, that we had two different cities. One city had a culture of, work to live. Another city had a culture of live to work. And you would see it in the hours and the people and how they worked. So whereas in one city, that by 4:58, it's cleared out. In another city at 4:58, beer cart comes out. People get settled in to really get the work going and have, it was very interesting to deal with that. Culture is really interesting when we talk about the deepening aspect of it too. In order for that to work, you have to have a culture of people that are not only bought into that, but really integrated and a part of it. How do we see culture? And I am going to add in a little sprinkle, because we can, with, people are really still battling over time. And what I mean by time is presence as well. Like everything from how the Zoom meeting is working to when we're in the office to when we're doing the retreat, these things that were part of almost scheduling have become now part of work culture. It's another weird part of it, how like return to office, like we never thought of that. We just did our work, I think, before. And suddenly it's become this stigmatism of all of these places and decisions and destinations. When we think about culture, how should we be thinking about it differently? Has it changed for you? Is it the same old, same old?
I mean, culture is I think, a tough thing to sometimes define, but here, the way I look at it is every company is going to have a culture of some sort. And the question is, do you want to embrace it or do you want to try to change it? And like one of the things that we did, I'll just give you some work that I did at Accenture. So when we had this 20,000 person group, and at that time, we pretty much only did software. A lot of our solutions were installing SAP or, custom technology. And we said, we need to shift the mindset away from implementing software to creating value. How do we do that? And the way we did it, and this is the 5th D, so I talked about distinctive, desirable, durable, dynamic. The 5th D is disseminated. And basically, once you understand what your differentiator is and what makes you special, you need to make sure first everybody internally understands that and how they personally contribute to the differentiator. So we need to get that out there. So whether that's culture or not, that's, I guess, up for debate. But I think we need to make sure that every person in the company understands this is my personal differentiator. This is what I do really well. And this is how I am aligned with and contribute to the differentiator of the organization. And so at Accenture, we basically took a group of people that were experts in a particular area, and we taught them our new methodology, our new approach about value creation, which was maybe a little different than we'd done in the past. Those people then worked with the next group, and that group worked with the next group. Within 9 months, we impacted 20,000 people. And the conversation, and to me, culture is conversation. The conversation on value creation shifted massively during those 9 months because it went away from what software are you installing to what is the value we are creating by installing this software. It might seem like a very simple thing, but it was a massive, massive change that lasted for years and impacted the bottom line of the company significantly.
Look, we used to talk about culture pre-pandemic all the time. It feels like now when we talk about culture, we talk about it in this remote or physical conversation, which has nothing to do with what the actual customers feel when they see this. Yeah. Do you think that the conversation around culture has been too muted or too slanted towards simply employees? There's something there that's been bothering me, and I don't know what it is.
Well, I think we need to, I think unfortunately culture, we sort of say that, can we have a strong culture in a purely virtual environment? And look, the jury, I think, is still out on that. So that's not my area of expertise. But I think if we start thinking about how do we make sure that everybody in our ecosystem, so beyond employees, for example, how do we work with our partners, suppliers, and vendors? If our differentiator in many cases is going to be a network, like when we talked about Apple, for example. Well, if it's a network, a network isn't employees. A network is different providers. I worked with a home assurance company. Basically, if a washing machine or a dishwasher breaks, and you are a customer of theirs, they will send somebody out to fix it. And they used to think they're differentiated with their pricing models, but what they very quickly realized when we worked together is it wasn't a differentiator because their customers or their competition, they were copying their pricing models in just a matter of weeks. So we looked at what is a durable differentiator that they have, and it was their network of technicians. It was the biggest, it was the best. And so instead of getting all caught up in pricing models, they needed them. They invested in their network. They gave them training, they gave them support, and they weren't exclusive arrangements with the technicians. So I think that built their culture, though. It wasn't just the employees of the company, but the technicians have to be part of, even though they're independent contractors or small companies, they needed to be part of that same culture and have that same belief. That's going to become more and more important as companies start to really disaggregate a bit and build that ecosystem.
Yeah. More speed bumps for them for sure.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
There is this idea of going deep, core to the book, core to what you're thinking now. When you've looked at organizations or thought about it in a more deep way, why do you think companies are challenged by that? Is there something in this idea of doubling down on the bet that's very panicky, that if they don't have enough hands in enough cookie jars, that's going to be perceived as problematic? I'm thinking about a CEO speaking to the board of directors and saying, we are going to go extremely deep. We are going to double down on that versus we're placing a lot of little bets. And you personality poker. I know you talk about. There's
Yeah.
always an analogy with gambling with you, Steve. But there's something interesting there about this challenge of going deep or saying it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, unfortunately, the quarterly earnings dictate a lot of decisions. Uh, I don't think that should be the way it is, though. I mean, so it's just it has to become a shift in terms of priorities. I'll give you one example, which I love, is a company, a little controversial, but they're Koch Industries, KOCH, out of Wichita, Kansas. They are
They
the second
dabbled in
largest private.
politics, right?
They doubled in politics. We'll put that part aside, but they are the second largest privately held company in the country, and they're one of the fastest growing companies in the country. They've grown. The number is ridiculous. I can't remember what it was, but multiples of the S&P 500 consistently for 5 decades. And they're not in any particular business. They're in I will say, the principal business. Coming back to where we started, they have a whole approach of management that is based on experimentation, that is based on leveraging existing capabilities. They have something called experimental discovery,
What do they sell?
where
Does
they give
anyone know what they sell? Do we know?
yeah, they sell paper towels, Dixie cups, brawny paper towels, oil, gas, petrochemicals, lycra, Stainmaster carpets. I mean, they make a lot of stuff,
Joking. Yeah.
but their philosophy is, how do we push decision making down from the top down to the lowest level of the organization? The people who are actually closest to know what's actually going on know what we can do and what's needed to be done. That distinctive capability that is highly desirable. And it's a great model. And but again, they're not focused, because they're privately held. They're not focused on what are we going to do over the next 3 months. They're focused on how can we impact the business in the long run. And I think
Yeah.
that's a really important question for any company to ask, regardless if you're publicly traded or not.
Yeah. One company that I kept thinking about and have some ties to it is Lego when it came to Pivotal. In a world where they could have gotten so distracted and been so caught up, and it's such a difficult industry to be in. I really felt like, as I was going through it again, you don't want to always shine the biggest and brightest companies on everything, but I just felt like there was a bit of a check mark next to everything, and how Lego both communicates in their culture and how they think about productization and what it looks like. It seems like they've really, if they didn't read Pivotal, it's almost like there was a blueprint for that you could have grabbed to create the book on.
Yeah, I love that example, because I think they recognize, yeah, they're in the little cube business, but they're much more than that. I didn't talk about Lego in the book, but a company I did talk about, which for me is like probably one of my actually, people who read the book, this story is their favorite. It's Radio Flyer. They had the original
Yeah.
Red Wagon.
The Red Riders,
And
yeah.
yeah, so it's the CEO, Robert Passon, is like the great grandson or something of the original founder, and so he and I talked, and what I loved is he said, look, when I talk to people about Radio Flyer, because I want to understand what people like, he said, the first thing that happens when I talk with them is their face lights up, they smile,
Nostalgia is
and
a
then they will
killer.
tell me a story. Yeah, they'll tell a story about, and even when I tell these stories, people come up to me afterwards and say, yeah, I had one of those wagons, and it wasn't a wagon, it was a spaceship, it was a rock, flying carpet. Somebody just told me the other day, it was like their centerpiece for their Christmas decorations every year, whatever it was. And so what he realized is we're not in the wagon business. We're in the smiles business. Now, think about that for a moment. Everything they do, they just opened up a retail store in Chicago. Their business is about making people smile. If you're on the phone with them and the person who's answering the phone understands we're not selling wagons, we're selling lifetime memories that people are going to cherish and will make them smile, you're going to be different on the phone engaging with a customer. That to me I think they're one of the greatest examples of it, just going from the very top to the very bottom of the organization, every person internalizing it, because it's not a product, it's an experience.
I love that. That's so great. Stephen, tell me the one thing that made you think differently.
I think the thing which has made me think differently is it's actually been my clients. Look, for 30 years, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of companies. And what I used to think was that there was a way to do work. And what I've realized is a lot of different ways work. There's not just a one size fits all strategy. And so I think that's really when I even try to write these books, I try to make sure I'm not being overly prescriptive, saying this is the way, because then I'm just providing a best practice, which may or may not be good. It might be stupid. So it's and it really comes back to something interesting. When I was at Accenture, I go back there a lot because there was some great experiences. We were creating this program, and originally it was going to be this big, deep methodology. Do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. And we realized that it should be principles. It was called Process Excellence Principles. And it was all around the 5 key principles, of which innovation was the core principle behind it. And it's timeless. It's timeless. I've met people. I was just at a conference just a couple of weeks ago where somebody was at Accenture and they remember process excellence principles. I've met people who 20 years later still use the materials. So we need to avoid prescriptive solutions and go back to the point that you made before is, isn't this obvious? Isn't this 101? Yeah. But we always seem to fail to deal with the foundational principles well.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about this when it comes to people will ask me about digital experiences and which ones work. And I've been inverting that to say text, images, audio, video, short form, long form, recorded, live. You've never had more ways to connect your story to a customer, and to think that somebody else did something on TikTok and you replicating that or doing it like you is going to be the result. Now, maybe, but I think the opportunity is that there's not one or two ways, but there's a million ways, and figuring out the one or two that work for you is going to create that, much in the same way that I always hated the whole white paper and best practice idea, because we didn't talk about this at all, but just luck is such a big factor too in all of this, that people don't want to bank on that, because you can't go to the market or your board of directors or a potential senior employee with the idea of luck. But there's a reality there that a lot of it is out of our control too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like survivorship bias. The people who survived are the ones who continue to talk about it. But 10,000 companies may have done exactly the same thing and failed. So
Yeah.
is it correlation? Is it causation? Or is it just coincidence? And these are the types of things I love to think about, because I'm an engineer, so I'm a bit of a nerd.
New book is called Pivotal. Personality poker is still a big deal for you. Let people know what you're working on, where they can find out more about what's going on.
Sure. So the way to find me is theinnovationspeaker.com. That's sometimes the easiest way to find me. But yeah, Personality Poker, it's a card game. I actually have some cards right here.
There you go.
Developed that 20 years ago, and it just keeps on getting bigger and bigger. And we now have a certification program on that. Invisible Solutions was my previous book. And I realized I love Personality Poker because it's a game. Well, what if I gamify everything I do? And so we're building a game around reframing problems, and that's going to be coming out later this year. We've got the Pivotal book. I'm using AI to create the audio book for Best Practices Are Stupid. It's a book I've had for a decade now. Never had an audiobook. I thought I'll use 11 Labs, clone my voice, and create an audiobook. And it's amazing what the technology can do.
I love it. Stephen, thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you. This is awesome.